In 1933, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. But for Hitler, power was only a beginning. Should we form a chosen band, he asked a friend, made up of those who really know? An order, a brotherhood of the Knights of the Holy Grail, around the Holy Grail of the pure blood. The eternal life provided by the Grail is valid only for the truly pure and noble.
Dietrich Eckhardt, Willi Dreyer, Horst Hoffmann.
In time, only the greatest criminals are remembered. The little men, those who helped the crime along its way, escape behind the crackle of history.
Albert Leo Schlageter.
This is Landsberg Castle in Bavaria. For a year in the early 20s, Adolf Hitler was a prisoner here. This is where he wrote Mein Kampf, the Bible of the Nazi Party, Hitler's dream for the future of the master race. History records that here, the greatest criminal planned the greatest crime. But there were many others, now forgotten, who gave to Hitler's fantasies the seal of intellectual and scientific approval.
Albert Müller.
It was professors from the universities, together with the Nazis, who piped the German people on a doomed journey through their own worst imaginings. A journey through a landscape of myth and legend, which reached from Atlantis to the castle of the Holy Grail. A quest into history to reveal the special destiny of the German race.
Walter Apelt.
Today, in the same beer kellers which were the engine rooms of the Nazi movement, enthusiastic audiences can share something of the authentic German experience. But for most of the 20th century, the search for what is truly German has come at a higher price. In 1945, Hitler was dead and Landsberg Castle had become war crimes prison number 1. Among the prisoners was an SS officer called Wolfram Sievers. Sievers had been in charge of an SS organization whose job was to use history and archaeology to prove the claims of the master race, whose task was to explore the greatness of the German soul. Before his execution, Sievers told his Allied interrogators an astonishing story, a story which ended in genocide, but which began in a search for Atlantis and the Holy Grail. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, the special destiny of the Germans was an idea whose time had come. Moreover, it was an idea that was underwritten by science. At that time, archaeology was still a new science, and the Germans were the masters. From Troy to Babylon, their excavations had recovered lost pasts and written new chapters for the human race. They had also been able to prove the truth of ancient myths. And now their archaeologists turn their attention to the origins of the Germans themselves. In the 19th century, European scholars had come to believe that the Northern Europeans belonged to a superior racial group. They called them Indo-Europeans, or Aryans. In 1902, the archaeologist Gustav Cassiner used the new science to prove that the early Germans were the original Aryans.
Gustav Cassiner was a very serious archaeologist, and he published his first article on the subject, I think, in 1902, and there was nothing racist about it at all. He was making the equation, which many archaeologists made, that if we're talking about the Proto-Indo-European language, that would have been spoken by a Proto-Indo-European people, a folk, and so the question was, where did these people live?
And where did Cassiner place the Aryan homeland?
For him, the homeland was in Germany. Every nation seeks some past, some heritage, some legitimacy, and if you're having a revolution, you have to have a myth. We are the true voice. We are bringing you back your true deep past, which has been overlooked in subsequent generations.
Aryans, a superior race. But there were those who went further. For them, the Germans were a chosen people whose origins were divine.
The moon we see now is not the first moon. In the time before time, there were 3 other moons. And 3 times, those moons crashed into Earth, destroying the life and civilization that had been built there. In between the destruction of the 3rd moon and the coming of the 4th moon, which is our moon, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed race lived on the island called Atlantis. They were lofty, educated artists as well as incomparable warriors. And they were brave, for only the brave could have survived the floods and the ice age that followed the destruction of the 3rd moon. The people of Atlantis were the source of all art and science, and they were the ancestors of the Germans.
Dreams like these had long been commonplace amongst German nationalists. But now the Nazis ruled Germany. They began to yoke the power of myth to their totalitarian machine. Among the Nazi chiefs, it was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who most systematically used the opportunities of power to turn his fantasy version of history into reality. Here in Wewelsburg, on the edge of the Teutoburger forest, Himmler found what he was looking for. Wewelsburg Castle was to be the centre of a new order of knights, a new aristocracy of blood and soil. A Camelot with the SS commanders as Knights of the Round Table. Inside, rooms were dedicated to figures of Nordic history and mythology. Himmler's own room was dedicated to King Heinrich I, the founder of the First Reich. There was a room for King Arthur, another for the Holy Grail. Never forget, Himmler told the SS, we are a knightly order from which we cannot withdraw, to which we are recruited by blood.
Also der hat einen Weitblick gehabt, Himmler, nicht? Und in diesem Weitblick ist der Webelsburg entstanden. Die SS ist die wirklich absolute Elite von alles, was gewesen ist. Heute ist man kriminell etc., aber die Welt will umgeschaltet werden. Aber reiner und intensiver und höheres Gut ist nicht da wie die SS. Und Gott sei Dank ist wirklich noch etwas da. Und Gott sei Dank sind noch einige Leute, die etwas wissen über die Welt und auch den ganzen, das Gedankengut.
What was Himmler hoping to create then in getting hold of the castle here?
Yeah, he wanted to create a focus point of all the aspirations he had towards religion, towards science, forming a new policy and things like that. It was the center of all these ideas, not of the practice, but of the ideas. To create a new Aryan person, a new Aryan society based on Aryan human beings, you have to change biology and you have to change the mind, the thinking of the people. And one important part of the conception of the world in the mind is religion.
Da war damals auch eine große Schlacht.
Ja, und in dem großen Wald dort liegen die Externsteine.
Ist das nicht das berühmte Sonnenheiligtum der Germanen?
Ja, ganz da oben wurde die Sommersonnenwende gefeiert.
Himmler believed that he was living in the era of the final disintegration of Christianity. It was time to restore the Externsteine to its place as the Teutonic Mecca, the heart of true Germanic religion. Archaeologists were given the task of proving its pagan origins. They found nothing, but few would speak out against the chief of the Gestapo. Meanwhile, from the stranger fringes of German life, others moved closer to the centre of power. One close advisor to Himmler was Karl Maria Willigut, an Austrian mystic who claimed descent from a long line of ancient German sages. Willigut had few obvious qualifications for the SS. He was a womanizer, he liked the bottle, and had spent a considerable time in a Salzburg lunatic asylum. Willigut was a direct link to the mystical German thinking of the 19th century. His claims to speak to the people of the past and to decipher their runes, the symbolic alphabet of the ancient Germans, made a deep impression on Himmler and his circle.
Für mich war das ein unglaublicher Mensch. Also ich war hoch interessiert an allem, was er erzählte, auch wenn ich natürlich manches hätte ja manches erzählen können, nicht? Aber es hat sich eben immer wieder durch andere Seiten bestätigt, was er sagt. Und das hat mich natürlich fasziniert, auch das, was er überhaupt erzählte.
With a new name, Weistor, Willigut was made a brigade Führer in the SS and spearheaded Himmler's attempt to form a new Germanic religion. He produced a 10-point manifesto for the elimination of Christianity from German life. It ended, characteristically, with his own runic sign.
Ja, das ist unsere alte Tradition, das ist unsere Herkunft. Die kann man doch nicht einfach wegschieben. Wir sind ja überdeckt gewesen von der christlich-jüdischen Religion und Tradition. Ja? Und die wollten die alte Tradition, die uns entsprach, wieder rausholen. Nicht? Das ist ganz klar.
For Himmler, many of the most sacred symbols of the Christian religion had been stolen by the Church from the ancient Aryans. He now set about restoring them to their rightful place in German tradition. The most powerful symbol of all was the Holy Grail, and Otto Rahn was Germany's leading authority on the Holy Grail. Now Himmler brought him into the SS.
One of the things one notices walking around the museum, we're in a castle, and you spoke of establishing a new kind of knighthood. You have here images of the Grail story. There is a Grail room here at Wewelsburg. I mean, is this just symbolic, or did they really believe that one day they might have such a thing in their hands?
No. These names of the rooms were to remember to history. But in the long term, maybe, and I think there are some hints in that direction, that they wanted to have a room where a real symbol would be kept here, but this was not realized, and we do not know how exact or how clear these ideas were.
For over 7 centuries, the story of the Holy Grail, the Grail castle which guarded it, and the knights who set out on the quest to find it, had played a central role in the German imagination. German scholars had long argued over what exactly the Grail was, whether it was originally not Christian at all, but a far more ancient sacred symbol of the Aryan knighthood. There were those who believed the Grail might actually be found. Some thought in Iran, others the ancient Cathar castles in the Pyrenees. Like Himmler, Otto Rahn was a believer, and he travelled across Europe in pursuit of the Grail legend.
Ich hatte ja das Buch gelesen und habe das dann dem Alten gegeben. Und der hat es also auch ganz fasziniert gelesen und sofort Himmler gegeben. Und er ist dann von Himmler, ist zwar in Stab gekommen, in persönlichen Stab, wie wir alle waren, aber er hatte seine eigene Arbeit. Er war also zwar angeschlossen, wahrscheinlich im Rass und Siedlung, das weiß ich gar nicht, ob er direkt angeschlossen war, ich weiß nur, dass er zum Stab gehörte, aber seine eigene Sache weiterarbeitete. Also über den Gral weiterforschte. Der Gral ist eine Idee gewesen. Kein direktes, fassbares Symbol, sondern eine Idee.
Stoß des Friedens zu sein, ziehen wir mit Huffel und Spaten stolz in die Zukunft hinein.
In the meantime, the SS were being mustered to rediscover the time when the core of the Nordic race was still pure and uncorrupted.
SS, Reichsarbeitsdienst und Männer der Wissenschaft bei Nauen ein ehemaliges germanisches Dorf frei. Frisch geht's mit Hacke und Spaten ans Werk, um die deutsche Vergangenheit wieder zu beleben. Es ist eine schöne und verpflichtende Aufgabe, den Spuren unserer Ahnen nachzugehen. In der nächsten Umgebung
Himmler
von Berlin
selbst hat natürlich auch die Möglichkeit, mit der Archäologie Politik zu machen, hat Himmler sicherlich auch gesehen. Er brauchte auch die Archäologie, um eine Identität für seine SS zu schaffen. Diese ganzen Dinge hat er auch gesehen. Aber Himmler hat an bestimmte pseudoreligiöse Inhalte der Archäologie geglaubt. Es gab ja Grabungen, diese Mythen und Legenden, diese Überlegenheit. Man hatte möglicherweise wirklich geglaubt, durch diese Kraft aus der Urgeschichte würde man Erfolge haben in der Jetztzeit. Das ist, glaube ich, das, was Himmler selbst geglaubt hat.
Himmler wanted to establish an archaeological site close to every SS unit. The closer to their ancestors, the more conscious they would be of belonging to the chosen few. Quedlinburg, near Leipzig, the medieval seat of the warrior king Heinrich I, known as the Hammer of the Slavs, and the founder of the First German Reich. On the 1000th anniversary of his death in 1936, Himmler's identification with the past could be observed at its most personal and intense.
Wir alle in unsere eigenen Ahnen glauben, das Jahr vor dir, das Jahr nachher. Und Himmler war überzeugt, dass er Heinrich I. war. Nicht, dass er zurückgekommen ist aus neuer Relegation von nun jetzt Heinrich Himmler, nicht, aber dass er früher in der Vorzeit Heinrich I. gewesen ist. Nicht?
Like knights of old in the service of their lord, was how the official SS journal described this procession.
Obwohl wir die Stadt mit geschmückt hatten und alles und so weiter, aber passen Sie auf, wenn der Himmler darauf ging, da war die SS dafür vorgesehen, alle, was am Fenster war, weg. Alle Neugierigen weg. Und der Himmler hat gesagt, dort, wo Heinrich raufgegangen ist, da will ich auch raufgehen. Und er war zugewachsen und alles. Und da musste man den Aufgang extra herrichten, damit er später auch darauf gehen konnte.
In Himmler's eyes, Henry I was the ideal SS leader, a man who never forgot that the strength of the Germans lies in the purity of their blood. Archaeologists were dispatched to find the hero's bones for reburial.
Ob man ihn nun an einem Goldzahn erkennen wollte oder an einem, das weiß man nicht. Man hat ihn nicht gefunden. Aber, und jetzt kommt die Verfälschung der Geschichte. Ein Professor, Herr Dr. Höhne, findet ein Jahr später, also in der Nacht vom 1. zum 2.7., legt er die Gebeine dort wieder in die Grabstelle zurück. Das stimmt ja nicht. Er wurde nicht gefunden, ist ja heute noch leer, das Grab. Sehen Sie, aber der schreibt, aber Himmler war beruhigt, scheinbar. Himmler war beruhigt. Jetzt liegen die Beine wieder da drin. So wurde die Geschichte verfälscht. Ja.
Did Himmler actually believe this kind of thing himself? I mean, when one looks at him, he was a very successful politician in 1930s terms. Did he actually believe in it, do you think?
Often Himmler is interpreted as two persons in one. One is the very successful politician, the great organizer of the SS, of concentration camps, things like that. And the other person combined in the same body is the believer. I think a real religious person, a person who believed in the importance of myths, of metaphysic things. He often, in his speeches, quoted thoughts like that. And therefore, all we know about Himmler points to that. He believed what he said.
Dass wir dieses Fest wieder feiern können, verdanken wir dem Mann, mit dessen Namen die Jugend heute Morgen ihre Feier begonnen hat und mit dessen Namen wir diesen Tag heute wieder schließen werden. Unser Führer Adolf Hitler, Sieg, Heil! Sieg! Sieg!
On the May Day festival of 1935, no maypole could be bigger than the Nazi maypole. With extraordinary speed, the Nazis were transforming what was ancient and traditional in German life. And for those inside the SS, there was no aspect of life the party did not reach.
SS ist eine rein rassische Sache und wenn es also rein rassisch ist, dann wird man auch genehmigt und das ist auch bei jeder Heirat von SS-Mann hat man diese Stammbaum. Himmler hat sogar Heiratsbefehl gegeben, nicht? Also, dass wenn die Männer zu lange einsam allein waren, dann war es vorbei, dann musste Familie sein und wenn sie dann Kinder hatten, und dann fing es erst an, dann hat man gezeigt, dass man gesund ist, dass man zum Aufbau für seine Volke geeignet ist.
Himmler had drawn up the SS marriage and engagement decree in 1931. When Meinut Rost van Tonningen wanted to get married, he had to apply to Himmler. Officers and their wives had to prove pure Aryan origins back to the 18th century. It was only after his fiancée had satisfied the SS race office that at Hilversum Town Hall on the 21st of December 1940 Van Tonningen's marriage was allowed to take place.
Wir wollten, dass die Menschen wieder normal göttlich waren, nicht? Also eine gute Ehe mit guten Kindern soll wiederholen und wieder eine gute Ehe. Und wenn man dreimal das wiederholt zum Großeltern, dann ist man verbunden mit dem Lande, wo man wohnt. Es ist so, dass man, ja, es klingt ein bisschen komisch, wenn man sagt, ein kleiner Gott ist, aber die Seele ist heilig, nie? Und wenn eine reine Seele ist, wird das gezüchtet weiter, nie?
In the late 1930s, a specially fitted ship, the Schwabenland, left Hamburg on a scientific expedition to the Southern Ocean. The Schwabenland's mission was to mark out territory for German expansion and to examine theories about the prehistory of the world. By now, many at the top of the Nazi hierarchy were competing with each other to boost Germany's role on the world stage. Himmler, too, was looking for ways of expanding his research. In 1935, he set up a new organization to study the history of the German race and to map the frontiers of the Aryan soul. The name of the new organization was the AHNENERBE, the Ancestral Heritage Society. The task, Himmler wrote in the manifesto, is to return the German people to the everlasting godly circle of past, present and future, of passing, being and becoming, to ancestors, the living and the descendants. In charge of the day-to-day administration of the AHNENERBE, Himmler appointed Wolfram Sievers. Sievers had joined the Nazi Party in 1929. Now, at the age of 30, he headed a project which involved some of the most eminent men in German academic life. Walter Wust was one of Germany's leading experts on India. Ernst Schaefer, a veteran explorer. Herbert Jankuhn was typical of the caliber of the academics joining the AHNENERBE. His curriculum vitae shows him to have been among the top flight of German archaeologists. Of the 46 department heads, 19 were professors, and a further 19 held doctorates. These scholars were now to be inducted into the SS.
In dem Moment, in dem dieses SS-Ahnenerbe, diese Forschungs- und Lehrgemeinschaft, wie sie sich nannte, SS-Ahnenerbe gegründet wurde, in dem Moment, in dem wirklich hochprofessionelle Archäologen diese Vorgeschichtsabteilung im SS-Ahnenerbe organisiert haben, nahm diese Richtung einen hochwissenschaftlichen Lauf.
The AHNENERBE's scope was global. Expeditions were planned to destinations defined as important centers of northern Aryan culture spread around the world. A scientific expedition to Iceland was accompanied by the Grail hunter Otto Rahn. It was hoped that an expedition to Peru in 1939 would find evidence of the tertiary people, the race which, according to their theories, populated the world during the period of the third moon. In the Canary Islands, explorers sought proofs for the existence of Atlantis. In Iran, the famous inscriptions at Behistun were examined for evidence of the earliest Aryan kings of pure Aryan blood. For many years to come, the AHNENERBE announced, many extensive expeditions are planned to faraway places.
Weitere frühzeitliche Dokumente finden wir am Valenciasee in Venezuela. Auffallend ist die ungewöhnlich langgestreckte Form der gefundenen toten Schädel. In Venezuela ist man überzeugt, durch diese Funde das gerissene Band mit dem versunkenen Atlantis wieder aufgefunden zu haben.
In 1938, the SS mounted their most ambitious expedition to Tibet. The prime object, they said, was to give answers to many questions in the ethnic, racial and biological fields. It was led by Ernst Schaefer, who had led 2 previous expeditions to Tibet. Among the members of his team was the young anthropologist Bruno Beger. The expedition left Germany in April 1938. With the permission of the British, they travelled through India into Tibet in an attempt to discover the origins of the Aryan people.
Größe der Füße, Länge von Arm und Hand, Farbe der Augen und der Haut, alles wird notiert.
Bruno Beger was in a long line of anthropologists who believed that the proportions of the human body were vital indicators of race, that it was possible to discover the moral and intellectual capacities of a person through the shape of the skull.
So war bald das Vertrauen zu uns, dass sich die Eingeborenen sogar herbeiließen, ihre Gesichter abformen zu lassen. Eine weiche, harzähnliche Masse, die beim Atmen nicht sonderlich stört, wird aufgetragen und so entsteht eine naturgetreue Maske. In den Augenblicken hilfloser Finsternis aber legt sich die alte Dämonenfurcht wie ein Albdruck auf das naive Gemüt des Eingeborenen. Bald ist die Masse erstarrt. Es ist ein lösender Augenblick für alle Beteiligten, als endlich die Maske abgenommen wird. So entstand Stück um Stück unsere rassenkundlichen Sammlung von den Menschentypen Hochasien.
We must set race at the center of life, said Hitler in Mein Kampf. Everything we admire on this earth today is only the creative product of a few peoples, and originally, perhaps, of one race. The roar of propaganda was relentless at every level of society. On the 10th of March 1937, here in the Hacker Keller in Munich, SS officers waited to hear one of Germany's leading experts on India, Professor Walter Wust, give a lecture on Hitler's Mein Kampf. His subject was Mein Kampf as the mirror of the Aryan worldview.
There is no more striking example, he told them, of the long-term working out of this tradition than the similarity between the words of the Führer and those of that other great Aryan personality, the Buddha. And this, remember, is one of Germany's top Indologists addressing the elite of the Nazi terror machine. He concluded by saying this, that there is only one explanation for this correspondence, and it is the essential explanation of the Nazis' whole worldview. And that is the basic idea of racial identity, an idea which has been preserved and handed down over thousands of years by the sacred concept, as he put it, of AHNENERBE, ancestral heritage. A heritage of which the SS had now become the embodiment and the guardians.
By By 1939, the SS had grown in number to 300,000. They were the Führer's Praetorian Guard. They ran the secret police and the concentration camps. Shall we form a brotherhood of knights around the Holy Grail of pure blood? Hitler had asked. Himmler had done it for him. Here were Teutonic knights. Here were knights of the Round Table. "50 years later, an Englishman, Stuart Russell, married to a local girl and settled in Wewelsburg, heads towards the centre of the Nazi universe. Stuart has become a local historian, an expert on the world Himmler built in the castle. A shadowy world, now pieced together from local stories and the reminiscences of old Nazis.
Well, we are now down in the crypt below the north tower of the Wewelsburg, in what the locals even today refer to as the Valhalla.
The documentary record is slim. Today, the meaning of Himmler's Wewelsburg can only be understood by entering the same symbolic world as the Reichsführer SS himself.
I'm now walking down a flight of 3 steps. 3 steps, by the way, referring to the Third Reich. Exactly this point was to mark what Himmler believed would be the center of the new world, just to give an idea of the dimension of the thing he was planning. If we look around the crypt, we see 12 stone plinths. We don't know, as with many other things concerning this room, what was actually to stand on these plinths or be in the niches behind the plinths. However, the figure 12, the number 12, is interesting for several reasons, or possibilities. We have the story of the 12 Knights of the Round Table. The legend of King Arthur is certainly something that interested Heinrich Himmler.
Long before the war, the German public had come to know how to read the meanings of these myths and legends.
The Bible, etc. We have 12 months in the year. There are so many possibilities.
Nach Osten schallt der Ruf durchs Land. Deutschritter nehmt das Schwert zur Hand. Vermehrt das Land, vermehrt den Wald, schafft Raum der Heimat, Raum den Erben.
As always in history, it's not what the experts say which matters, the scientists, the technologists, the theologians. It's how they put their ideals into practice in real life which counts. Here at Wewelsburg in the 1930s, a fantasy of German history was made concrete. The myth of medieval knighthood, of round tables and Teutonic knights. The myth of the male military order, austere and disciplined with its secret rituals. Merciless and moral, as Himmler said. But in all such myths of knighthood, there has to be a quest for knowledge, for power, and for conquest. The medieval Teutonic knights, in the end, failed in their battles against the Slavs. But their modern successors, the SS, armed with an ideology which was based on pure historical fantasy, would now embark upon the conquest of the East.
In 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. 2 years later, they struck at Russia. The promised Nazi empire to the east was in the process of creation. Vast swathes of territory fell to the Nazis. Vast numbers of prisoners were taken. While Nazi racial theory could afford to be lenient towards the conquered people of Norway or Holland, even France, now whole populations who could expect no mercy fell under German rule. Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews. Behind the front line as it moved eastwards, the Nazi guardians of Aryan culture competed with each other to grab the cultural treasures of the conquered territories. As Allied intelligence documents reveal, the AHNENERBE, led by its professors and scholars, went in for looting on a grandiose scale. From all over occupied Europe, scientific collections and libraries, archaeological finds, the contents of entire museums were shipped back to AHNENERBE headquarters in Berlin, or to Himmler's castle at Wewelsburg. Himmler and Sievers founded a special unit, the Sonderkommando Yankun, to supervise the plunder.
Man hat Museen dort geplündert oder Sammlungen sichergestellt, wie es hieß. Also die Chance, in ein völlig neues, bislang für Archäologen unbekanntes Terrain vorzudringen, war sicherlich bei diesen, die an der Ostfront beteiligt waren, der Hauptmotor.
Himmler at a prisoner of war camp in Russia in 1941. It is the curse of greatness, he said, that it must step over dead bodies to create new life. The professors, doctors and scholars of the AHNENERBE now discovered that they too must share this curse of greatness. In October 1941, Sievers, together with a Luftwaffe medical officer, Dr. Russia, brought Ernst Schäfer, the leader of the Tibet expedition, to Dachau. They wanted Schäfer to photograph Russia's experiments on human beings. Through a small window, Schäfer was able to observe another of the AHNENERBE's research projects. Years later, another witness would describe what Schäfer saw to a Nuremberg court. I have personally seen through the observation window of a chamber when a prisoner inside would withstand a vacuum until his lungs exploded. Some experiments gave men such pressure in their heads that they would go mad and pull out their hair to relieve the pressure. They would tear their heads and faces with their fingers and nails to maim themselves in their madness. They would beat the walls with their heads and hands and scream to relieve the pressure on their eardrums. These cases of extreme vacuums generally ended in the death of the subject. Worse was to come. In 1943, the AHNENERBE sent a research team to Auschwitz. Details of this mission emerged in 1946 at the trial of Wolfram Sievers.
Witness, you are Wolfram Sievers and you were Reichsmanager of the AHNENERBE, the Ancestral Heritage Society, were you not?
Ich war der Reichsgeschäftsführer des Ahnenerbes.
Did you ever hear of Hirt's, Professor Hirt's skeleton collection?
Es handelte sich hier um eine Angelegenheit der Anatomie der Universität Straßburg.
I asked you, did you hear about it?
Ich habe Ihre Frage nicht im Anfang verstanden.
You played an active part in the collection of those skeletons.
Nein.
This was just a piece of academic research, was it?
Jawohl.
Professor Hirt, his anatomy collection in Strasbourg, had a skull collection of nearly all races and people, with the exception of Jews. The suggestion was made that there was an abundance of Jews in the concentration camps.
Where were you going to get the skeletons from?
Die Einzelheiten sollte Professor Hirt mit...
Now, just answer my question, witness, because you know perfectly well the answer to it. Where were you going to get those skeletons from?
Die sollten zur Verfügung gestellt werden aus Auschwitz.
It was Bruno Beger, the anthropologist from the Tibet expedition, who was to select the Jews for the skeleton collection and measure them while they were still alive.
Before they were murdered, they were anthropologically measured. That was all there was to it, was it?
Und Moulagen wurden von den Leuten genommen.
Now I want you to look at a letter which you sent to Brandt, headed the AHNENERBE. Marked secret. It's addressed to Brandt, Himmler's adjutant. It's your letter, witness, isn't it? It's your signature at the bottom of it.
Jawohl.
I'll read it out.
Following the subsequently induced death of the Jew, whose head should not be damaged, the delegate will separate the head from the body and will forward it to its proper point of destination in a hermetically sealed tin can, especially produced for this purpose and filled with a conserving fluid. Having arrived at the laboratory, the comparison tests and anatomical research of the skull can proceed. That was the report which you forwarded to Brandt.
The visit of Sievers and Schaefer to Dachau shows the connection between the theory and the practice of the AHNENERBE, between the archaeological digs and the Sanskrit scholarship and the crimes against humanity. Schaefer's colleague from Tibet, Bruno Beger, would later go to Auschwitz to make face masks of Jewish prisoners. All of them protested that this was done for the purposes of science. The Allied officer who interrogated Sievers at the end of the war summed it up like this: "The AHNENERBE's plan," he said, "linked the picking of the brains of contemporary historians and scientists with the picking of the flesh off the bones of the unfortunate victims whose skulls were needed as exhibition pieces, along with those who'd been dug up from their prehistoric resting places."
Great scholars of international repute who worked for the AHNENERBE. Do you think they knew about the atrocities that were being done by other parts of the organization? Did the historians and archaeologists know about this?
Yes, I'm sure they knew that. One has to see that each intellectual person in that time, and even within these roles that these archaeologists played, high-ranking SS officers that wore uniforms and so on. They were together in discussions within the council of the AHNENERBE. Jan Kuhn was very near to Himmler, for example. So I know they knew that.
They knew.
And it is just a question of how we see that. How we see that now. Was it okay that they knew that? And they say it was, because we took the chance to support our subject, our archaeology, and the other things we couldn't change.
(1944). Himmler says the unsayable. He tells senior Nazis of the killing of the Jews. The knights of the Round Table still ride like a pale shadow behind the doleful text of the speech. Never has our courage failed. Never have we lost our sense of humour. The job was accomplished without our men or our officers suffering injury to spirit or soul.
Man kann den ganzen Krieg vergleichen mit dem Glaubenskrieg. Nicht? Wir alle haben nie geglaubt, dass wir den Krieg verlieren würden, weil das Gedankengut so edel, so gut war. Und so Hitler wollte nie Krieg. Und Hitler wollte nur das ganze Germanien tun, um die Rasse zusammenbündeln. Nicht?
Sievers, Military Tribunal I has found and adjudged you guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, for your said crimes on which you have been and now stand convicted. Military Tribunal I sentences you, Wolfram Sievers, to death by hanging, and may God have mercy upon your soul. The officer of the guard will remove the defendant Sievers.
All members of the AHNENERBE, in spite of Sievers, who was executed, but all members of the AHNENERBE became important scholars in the post-war period. And after only a very few years, most of these archaeologists became the heads of departments of new institutions. And it is an interesting aspect that one can't find pictures of SS AHNENERBE archaeologists that wore uniforms within the literature. It is very difficult to get pictures of that.
Sievers was executed in this yard, overlooked by the window of the room where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. These events took place 50 or 60 years ago now, and it would be easy to dismiss Sievers and the scholars of the AHNENERBE as a lunatic fringe. But that's not how they were seen by the Allied officers who interrogated them. Their report ends by saying this: "It cannot be too strongly emphasized that this was not a crackpot organization. And these were men of the highest caliber, professors from the leading universities, men of the caliber of the atom splitters and the V-bomb designers, engaged in a project to rewrite the record of the past in order to influence the future course of history."